Well, that was just great. And I want to thank you for being a part of Founders Day Friday. And want to say a special word of thanks to those that gave wonderful testimonies this evening. And it's been a great night. And we're so glad to see each and every one of you here at Reformers Unanimous here in Rockford. I have the privilege of traveling almost every week and meeting with people and hearing their testimonies of the transforming power of Christ in their lives as they were introduced to the Lord through the ministry of Reformers Unanimous. Recently I was in Australia, in Rockhampton, Australia, preaching, and a fine-looking young man came up to me and introduced himself, said he was from New Zealand, and introduced me to his wife and to his children, and said, I wanted to get an opportunity to meet you and tell you the impact of Reformers Unanimous in my life in New Zealand. He said, I was a drug addict, and I saw a sign outside of a church. I'd have never visited that church. In our minds, that church was a cult. And we weren't church-going people anyway. But he said, I went to that church and met some people that introduced me to the curriculum of Reformers Unanimous. He said, I got saved, and my wife got saved. And he said, the reason we're in Rockhampton, Australia, is I'm enrolled in the Bible college, and I'm training to become a preacher of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Praise the Lord for God's transforming power. I never even imagined in 1993 when Brother Currington walked back through the doors of our church, or back through, if you go through these doors and then out that entrance where you came in this evening, that's where I first saw Steve after several years. And I'd known him since he was 5 years of age, and I was 18 when we first met in 1971, 1972, when his mom got saved, and then Steve and his brothers and family began coming to church here. I had just started myself. I was just 18 years of age, just out of high school, moved here from Michigan, and was enrolled in Bible college up the road and working on extension. Then Steve became one of my young people, and I had the privilege of being his youth pastor and then his pastor. But, sin took him away from the Lord and from us. And when he came back, I could never have imagined the transformation that God would bring about in his life, and then the wonderful ministry that God would give to him of Reformers Unanimous. In fact, I can't even remember exactly how we came up with the name, but I'm sure we didn't intend to, at the beginning, we didn't think of anything beyond the borders of Rockford, Illinois, and really Steve's circle of friends for whom he was burdened. But God has an amazing way of taking the unlikely and accomplishing the unusual, doesn't he? And that's exactly what he did. And something happened, though, and 2 years ago, the 30th of October, on Saturday late afternoon. And it's happened to me before, what I'm going to talk to you about for a few minutes tonight. But the circumstances, of course, were the homegoing of Brother Currington to heaven. And when I heard the news, the moment that I heard the news, I was at home, just gotten home. I was getting ready to go out and speak at taking my son along with me, and to speak at a banquet. And as soon as I heard that Brother Currington's life was in just desperate need of God's intervention if he were to live, I knew it was serious when Lori called. And I immediately fell to my knees and I prayed. and asked God to spare his life. So God, keep him alive. There's only a couple of us in the house. The rest of the family, my wife was actually out of town speaking somewhere, and cried out unto the Lord. But God didn't answer my prayer the way I thought he should. God told me no. Now, there's a lot in the Bible about prayer. There's a lot of exhortation to pray in the Bible. Pray without ceasing. Call unto me, and I will answer thee, and will show thee great and mighty things which thou knowest not, God says. Ask, and it shall be given unto you. Seek, and ye shall find. Knock, and it shall be opened unto you. God, throughout his word, compels us to pray over and over and over again. Somebody took my pulpit away. I need those Kleenex out of it. So we're exhorted to pray. We're promised God will hear and will answer our prayers. What we're not promised is, however, that God will always answer yes. And as a result of that, oftentimes sincere people that love God and want God's best in their lives find themselves in a dilemma. They've been taught that God is all-powerful, that he can do anything. And that's true. They, like myself, they've also been taught that God absolutely, perfectly loves us. And that's true too. And then we ask our Father in heaven, this God who's all-powerful and all-loving, we ask him for something, and he doesn't answer us the way we think that he should. It's frustrating to us. If you've never been frustrated by God and in your prayer life, then you don't pray. But when you pray and you ask God, and then you know that he can do anything, and then he doesn't, and particularly when it causes problems in your life, it can be very, very frustrating. Believe me, I wanted Steve Currington to live here, not live there yet. He and I sat in a restaurant and he took a little piece of paper and drew out little ideas of a Bible study on Friday night in 1995. And then I asked him to take and write out what it is that God did to change his life. And he came back a little while later to another time with, if God's against it, so am I. He said, this is what changed my life, when I caught a hold of these 10 principles. I said, wow, I've never seen anything like that. They're all in the Bible, but I've never seen anything laid out like that. And of course, as the RU rolled out and Steve would go to work in the morning, he'd been fired by the man that owned the company, Road Ranger, and you saw his testimony, Dan Arnold, at Steve's funeral service there in the Metro Center. But Dan Arnold, Steve was out away from the Lord, got saved, and Steve got right with God, and Steve ended up working for him and had an executive position, and of course raising his family for the Lord, and busy working then developing this ministry. And it was very time consuming. You know, people with severe problems in their lives, they could create a lot of problems, take a lot of time and a lot of energy. And Steve, as you know, was one that just always concerned about people and willing to spend and be spent on behalf of their needs. Well, I'm praying to God, keep this man alive, because by this time 2 years ago, you know, this thing was far, far beyond what he and I ever had imagined. I still remember when we opened a men's home and thought, well, we have a few men here and maybe we'll have something for 3 or 4 or 5 men, and family in our church bought a house that had an upstairs apartment in it to rent to us. And I can remember thinking, well, now this is just going to be dandy. And then Steve had 5, then 6, then 7, then 8 in there. Then he said, well, we need a bigger place. Then we need another place. And we had rented a house here and rented a house there and rented a house over there. And this thing was just growing and growing and growing. And 2 years ago, that Saturday afternoon, some of it selfishly, but I prayed and I begged God to keep him alive. I remember starting a women's home, ladies' home, and thinking, wow, what are we going to do with that? I remember Joy graduating from Bible college, and she never brought home stray animals. She just brought home stray women. She'd forewarn us, Diane and I'd be traveling. In fact, I can still remember we're gone somewhere, and she calls us. I thought I'd tell you before you got home there's somebody living here and at the house. And we knew she was destined to be to work with ladies. But I thought, man, Brother Currington, God, if you take him home, you're going to leave me in a world of hurt. And a lot of people. But God said no. Now in 2 Corinthians chapter number 12, where we're going to be tonight, if you have a Bible, 2 Corinthians 12, we find God telling the Apostle Paul no. And God's told you and me no on the occasion, and he's told all of us that are his children over the centuries, he's told us no for various reasons that we're going to talk about for these next few minutes. It's really important that you understand this, because the devil's going to whisper in your ear when God tells you no, and God's not going to say it verbally. At least he hasn't ever said that to me. And I don't have any indication that he did that to Paul either, the apostle here, as God tells him no, as we see here in verse number 8 of 2 Corinthians 12. But God will tell us no, and the devil will whisper in our ear these little lies. He'll say, some God you pray to. Yeah. That can become a trigger. It can become a discouragement. It can become an excuse, what we would think would be a reason. Well, if God doesn't love me any more than that, then I'm not going to bother serving him and loving him back. See? A lot of people do bad things to themselves and to others, things they know are bad for themselves. But they do it because God's let them down in their minds. Now, I want you to know that, humanly speaking, the death of a godly man, Steve Currington, a great husband, good father, the founder of a Christian ministry that was rapidly growing. Humanly speaking, his death did not make sense. But I'm learning something about God and about life and about prayer and answered prayer. I'm learning that just because something doesn't make sense does not mean that it's senseless. Let me say that again. Just because something does not make sense does not mean that it's senseless. It just means that you and I can't grasp what God's up to, because God's so much bigger than you and me. God never has made a mistake. Did you know that his pencils have no erasers? Did you know that? Did you know there are some words that God has never had to say, like oops? Now, you and I may think that God's made a mistake, but he's never one time ever made a mistake. And what happened that Saturday afternoon that we remember tonight, and we celebrate the wonderful life of this man in the very middle of his years, raising a large family and serving the Lord dynamically. We scratch our heads, as I did that night, and sitting in my car after all things were over and weeping until I couldn't weep anymore, just saying, oh God, why are you doing this? Why didn't you answer my prayer with a yes? I think I can feel a little bit like the disciples of John the Baptist when he was arrested and his death came and his head was severed from his body, and there was an element of frustration and pain. And those that had followed John the Baptist, the forerunner of Christ, and his cousin, and they said, Jesus was there. I had close proximity to John. Jesus was obviously able to save John Baptist from being killed. He could have stopped him from being beheaded. Surely, if the wind and the waves obey him, he could have stopped that sword from severing the head of that man of God. Why didn't God do that? Why didn't Jesus even come to see John in prison? Why didn't he stop him from doing it? And then furthermore, if Jesus could raise the dead, and they saw that he could, then why didn't he put John's head back on his shoulders? You do believe God could have done that, don't you? Sure he could. But he did not, because God had a bigger purpose and a bigger plan. God doesn't always say yes to you and me, and he never has to apologize. But the fact that he tells us no, the fact that sometimes he does things that don't make sense, that causes an element of frustration that then leads to a lot of people abandoning their faith in Christ. And I don't want that to happen to you. This isn't my first rodeo, 4 decades I've been privileged to be a part of this place, and I've watched literally tens of thousands of people come and go and get saved and baptized and begin to grow spiritually, and then become discouraged in their Christian life. And they are making decisions and choices that were outside of the will of God, but because in some way, for some reason, when they were in need and they cried out to God for his help, the answer wasn't what they expected. The baby died. The marriage dissolved. The child didn't come back home. The bankruptcy did go through. The cancer was terminal. We ought to pray. The Bible commands us to pray and commends us to pray. But the reality of life is, as a Christian, that even if you're the Apostle Paul, verse number 7, and lest I should be exalted above measure, he writes, through the abundance of the revelations there was given to me a thorn in the flesh, the messenger of Satan, he calls him, to buffet me, lest I should be exalted above measure. And he didn't like it. I don't know if it was an it or a him or a her, whether it was a physical illness. He calls it an infirmity in verse number 9. But whoever it was, whatever it was, Paul, smack dab in the middle of God's will, writing the Bible for us and starting churches and sacrificing incredibly. In fact, look back at 2 Corinthians chapter number 11, verse 24. Listen to this personal testimony of the price that Paul paid for serving Jesus Christ and to giving us nearly half of the New Testament. He said, of the Jews 5 times received I 40 stripes, save one, 195 lashes on his back. Not just lashes, that bruises that would go away. Not just little black and blue marks, but I mean that broke through the skin and left permanent scars on the back of that man of God. 195. Thrice he said, verse 25, was I beaten with rods. These rods would ruin the spinal cord of the person being beaten with the rods. This was not some simple beating. I went to the chiropractor this morning. sitting in one of those rooms waiting for the torture man to show up. That's what he is. He's a man of torture. And they've got a picture of the spinal column of an adult human being there, and all of those 24, some of you have problems with that, the cervical or the thoracic or the lumbar, and you get one of those discs, bulging disc. They tell you when it happens to you, it's like the jelly coming out of a sweet roll. It's not like jelly coming out of a sweet roll. That's sweet and tasty. Ah, man, I'll tell you, when that little disc starts coming out, that's horribly painful. Can't roll out of bed. Takes me about 20 minutes just to be able to stand up in the morning sometimes. So I go to the chiropractor, and you know, when they use the rods and beat somebody with the rods, it would ruin their spine. Nobody beaten with the rods, we're told historically, no man or woman ever beaten with the rods once could ever stand straight again. You ever picture in your mind what Paul the apostle must have looked like? 195 scars from the cat of nine tails that had lacerated his body from his face to his ankles. Beaten with rods 3 times so that he couldn't stand straight. Stoned. Not the kind you're thinking of. No, at Lystra. At Lystra, Derby, he preached the gospel. He was doing the will of God. They not only did not want him in their city, they wanted to kill him. And they did. Yes. Israel's a land of stones, big boulders, but baseball and softball size jagged stones and rocks just lay on the surface. Most places. So there in Lystra, they pick up stones and they stone this man. Can you imagine what he would look like? His body lacerated with 195 lashings of the cat of nine tails, 3 times with the beaten with the rods, and stoned. Now, in order to kill a person in stoning, it was very difficult to kill a person without smashing their skull. You know, God restored life to Paul, but the Bible doesn't tell us that God restored his complexion. You know, I can just imagine his face pitted with the scars of those rocks. His skull indented in various places, unable to stand straight any longer. He said 3 times he was shipwrecked. I capsized a little sailboat one time and like to have died. I can't even imagine being in a shipwreck, can you? I have a problem with motion sickness. Whenever I get on a boat, unless it's very, very smooth water, something begins to happen in my inner ears that somehow are connected to my stomach. It's not very long before what I ate that morning is now in front of me. And on a boat, as my wife fondly says, Paul's chumming. The fishing's getting better. Then last night's supper. Can you imagine it? Being on a ship and then having the shipwreck and thrown into the sea. He said, a night and a day I was in the deep. In journeyings often, he rarely stayed very long in one place. They either had revival or riot. But every place he went, the Bible says in verse 26, in perils of waters, in perils of robbers, in perils by mine own countrymen, in perils by the heathen, in perils in the city, in perils in the wilderness, in perils in the sea, in perils among false brethren, in weariness and painfulness, and watchings often, in hunger and thirst, in fastings often, in cold and nakedness. Hey, next time we want to complain, bite our tongue, may we bite our tongue. May we not have some fancy unbiblical expectations of what it means to be a follower of Jesus Christ. Benny Hinn has infiltrated Christianity and Christian thinking. All this prosperity gospel preaching that somehow when you become a follower of Jesus Christ, everything's supposed to go nice and rosy. And when you happen to have a bad day, then you can just pray, and God, like Aladdin's lamp, you just rub him and a genie comes out and grants you your wishes. My friend, that's not what the Bible teaches. It's tough being a sold-out soldier of Jesus Christ. And our captain of our salvation does not always answer our requests with a yes. So Paul was given a thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to buffet him. And so he prayed. He said, for this thing I besought the Lord thrice. I besought. That wasn't just a little, by the way, if you happen to get around to it, Father. Not at all. It was, oh, Father. Now, I tell you, this man must have had a high level of pain tolerance to keep going like he did. He was unusual. Most of us men are real sissies when it comes to pain. When I stood there and watched my first child being born, Jason, my wife in the throes of labor, and that child coming out, listening to her. In fact, she grabbed me by the belt when she was in labor. She pulled me up close. She said, Paul, when I get to heaven, I'm going to kill Eve. I was thinking, bless God, I'm sure glad that babies aren't given to men to give birth to. Well, I'll tell you what, there'd only been one Kingsbury following on. I want to tell you that. After that first one, that had been all she wrote for me. Man, she made me hurt just watching her there. But Paul had a high level of pain tolerance for all he'd gone through. And you'd think after all he's sacrificed and all he's suffered, that this messenger of Satan that's buffeting him, slapping him, smacking him around like a thorn in his flesh, and an infirmity of sorts he calls it there. You'd have thought that when Paul begged God and pled with God, said, all right, just take this away. You'd have thought if God were anything fair at all, you'd have thought, my goodness, son, I'm going to take this away. But he didn't. And he's not going to take your problems away either all the time. Well, why not? I'm glad you asked. Number one, God said no to Paul's prayer to prevent a potential problem. Now, the Bible here says that of Paul, in verse number 7, he recognized now, after this was over, and through inspiration from God, that there was a reason why this messenger of Satan was there buffeting him. And it's found in verse number 7, at the beginning, at the end of verse number 7. He said, unless I should be exalted above measure through the abundance of the revelations. That means since I've been given so much of the Bible, And then he also, earlier in chapter number 12, talks about, and this is probably himself, of getting caught up into the third heaven. I mean, it looks like there at Lystra, I was telling you about when he got stoned, he died, went to heaven, and God let him look around a little bit and then sent him back to earth. So he said, I had an abundance of revelations. And he said, that could have exalted me above measure. Now, just to make sure we don't miss it, at the end of the verse, he wraps it up with the same idea. He said, God sent a messenger of Satan. He allowed him in my life. And I asked him once, I asked him twice, and 3 times I pled and begged and besought him. He said, no, 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 God said. Because God saw that without this messenger of Satan, I would have been exalted above measure. So God told Paul no to prevent a potential problem. It was pride. We know that only by pride cometh contention. We know that these 6 things doth the Lord hate, yea, 7 are an abomination unto him. And the first one is a proud look. We know it was because of pride that Lucifer said, I will be exalted above the stars of heaven. I will be like the Most High God. Why are you talking that way, Lucifer? You've got a big job in heaven already. One of the archangels serving along with Gabriel and Michael there. In charge of all the worship and music in heaven. What in heaven's name are you thinking? Oh, I'm not content. I don't want to dislodge God from his throne, but I want him to move over. I want to have equal say along with God. Pride. And you know God hates pride. In fact, he resists the proud but gives grace to the humble. And so God allowed this worm in his life, this problem, this buffeting, this thorn in the flesh, because that problem kept Paul's feet on the ground, kept him from becoming proud, saved his ministry. We'll be glad when we get to the other side and we find out the reasons why God said no and how it saved us from problems. Like my little grandson sitting in the back seat of the car. Grandpa, he said, can I drive? It takes mustered up all of the nerve I have just to let my 15-year-old son drive, let alone a 3-year-old. Yeah. Oh, he thinks I'm ready to drive. I was sitting up here on my golf cart the other night watching a soccer game. And Ben and Robin Erickson's little boy came up to me, I don't know what his name is, Benjamin, I don't know. And he said, can I drive your golf cart? I said, no. He said, I know how to drive that. I said, you do? Yeah, I've been watching you. Yeah? I said, you ain't driving it. A few minutes later, I see him sneaking around the other side. Now, it's an electric golf cart. He's sneaking around the other side, and he just wants to come up and sit next to Pastor on the golf cart. So he scoots up there next to me. Hi, Pastor. Hi, son. Watch the game. So I'm looking up at the game. All of a sudden, that little lad scoots forward in the seat, reaches down, hits the gas pedal, dislodges the brakes, starts the golf cart. Of course, I was there, slammed down the brakes, threw him out of the cart, just threw him out. No, not really. But he thought he's ready to drive a golf cart. But he's not. Oh, he wanted to drive the golf cart. But he wasn't ready. Now, next time God tells you no, just figure it out. He's trying to prevent you from a disaster, a problem in your life. He knows what's best. Let's just let him be God. You know? So God said no. Paul said, I can see it now. And he told me no because he could see that it would have made me proud, and then that had just ruined my ministry. He said there's another reason. He wants to perfect me with his grace. Look at verse number 9. God spoke to Paul and told him, my grace. See, Paul said, I don't want the problem. God said, no, I want you to have the problem. But this is a thorn in the flesh. That's all right. I want you to have the thorn in the flesh. Yeah, but it's a messenger of Satan. I know it, and Satan knows it, but he's buffeted me. I know all that too, Paul, but I want you to have it. But why? Why don't you just take it away? And he said, God told him, he said, I want you to see the sufficiency of my grace, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. You see, this thorn in the flesh, this just weakened Paul. I don't really understand this. This is really hard to grasp, and you young people, it'd take you a while to sort this out. But I can tell you there's a time in your life when you think you're strong and you're really weak. And there are times in your life then when you figure out, you think, man, I'm just so weak. And God's grace has made you strong. Yeah. You know, God's not interested in you gaining more self-confidence. He wants you to have Christ confidence. He wants you and I to find out how wonderful and sufficient his grace is. You know, we like to see answers to prayer where the problem is removed. God wants to see answers to prayer when we accept the problem remaining and we still keep moving forward for him. We say, all right, one of my best friends is gone. Father, I just don't, I think you, I wanted him to stay here, but he's gone. The wife said, my husband's gone, but I'm going to draw on your sufficient grace, and I'm going to keep on loving you, living for you, and serving you with my life. And everybody from here to around the world that know about the situation, they stand back, and I don't travel to any city any week of the year. Next week I'll be in Puerto Rico. Last week I was in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. The week before that in Clinton, Maryland. And I don't go anywhere but what somebody says to me, how's Mrs. Currington? What a joy to report. She's loving the Lord and living for God and serving him. And then here's what somebody will say. Wow, what a wonderful testimony. You see, that's a testimony to the grace of God. You know, you think about it. When God tells somebody no, God must see something in us, in them. He says, you know what? This person has the potential just to trust in me, and I can really demonstrate my grace through this individual by leaving the burden on their shoulders that humanly you'd think nobody could ever bear, and then showing them they don't really have to bear it on their own because God is sufficient. Can I tell you something that's a wonderful thing to discover in the Christian life, but you don't discover it until God tells you no a number of times. You get to the place when you know that God's enough. I said, God's enough. It's wonderful to have the support and everything else in life, but I'll tell you, God is sufficient. He truly is. But if he gave you everything you wanted, spoiled you rotten, we'd never really have to depend on him. So he says, I'm going to give you burdens that you can't carry. You try, but you're going to come to the place where you're too weak and you say, I just can't. And then he says, you're going to find my grace is sufficient. And you're going to get up with that burden, and you're going to keep going. You're going to keep going. You're going to keep going. And people are going to stand back and say, wow, God's grace is sufficient. One of the biggest blessings in our church, one of the greatest blessings in my life, is the ministry of Mr. Paul Inman that serves in RU right here. I mean, when he gets up and to sing in church and play the flute, I mean, it's just, you can just, as soon as he walks out from there, you can hear the buzz. Sometimes people start clapping. But you know, I was there when, soon after, he had the sweetest, godliest wife you'd ever imagine. Marcy was one of the best Christians I've ever met. Loved the Lord. But she suffered with cancer. And you know, a lesser man, when he buried his dear wife, they were just like this. They were just in absolute love with one another. But that's probably been, Paul, how many years has it been? 15 years. And you know what? He didn't want God to take his wife. Fact is, he'll tell you he was pretty upset about it. But you know, he's a demonstration now and an inspiration to us that God's enough. God's enough. So God told Paul no. Thirdly, God told Paul no. Verse number 10. He says, therefore I take pleasure in infirmities and reproaches and necessities and persecutions and distresses for Christ's sake. God told Paul no for the sake of the person of Christ. You know, when Paul, from the writing of 2 Corinthians, he went on to write these wonderful pastoral epistles, probably also the book of Hebrews. And though it's all inspired by God, there's a maturing that took place in this man of God's life that exalted the person of Christ. And he said, I've endured all these persecutions, I've gone through all of this for Christ's sake. For Christ's sake. Now, some people use that little term in a slang or a cursing way, but it's a biblical term misused and abused. You see, oftentimes God allows people and problems and pressure and pain to remain in our lives, though we're sincere in our asking for Him to remove it, because ultimately it will help propagate the gospel of Jesus Christ. You see, the purpose of Christ was to die for mankind's sins. And that message God has chosen to communicate to the world through His people. And the testimony of Christ rings clearly through the life of a child of God that is accepting and enduring pain and suffering. And yet, for Christ's sake, they keep pressing on. God will bring into your life situations that are unpleasant and painful. And you'll cry out, you'll say, please take it away. And that's okay. But if He tells you no, for Christ's sake, don't quit journaling. Don't quit coming to RU. Don't quit going to church. Don't quit praying. Don't quit witnessing. Don't quit living for Jesus Christ and loving others. Because after all, it's for Christ's sake. You know, Even in the homegoing of Brother Currington, who would have imagined that the ministry that he began would continue to grow and expand exponentially and potentially. I've given up trying to, if people ask me how big, I say it all depends on how long before Jesus comes back again. Will 1,000 be the plateau if Jesus doesn't come back again? No. There'll be more chapters than that. Will 40,000 to 45,000 students in prisons and in churches at RU chapters meeting every week here and in 25 foreign countries, like doing what we're doing tonight, will that be it? No, not if Jesus doesn't come back again. And if we continue living right, doing the right things. You see, it's for Christ's sake. It's for Christ's sake. Every time I've prayed and asked God in a serious issue that was bothering me or seemed to be hindering me, and God said no, inevitably new ministry opportunity to people opened up because it's for Christ's sake. Many of you know Mrs. Kingsbury and I have a handicapped daughter, but what only a few of you know, perhaps our own children from experience, and maybe Miss Pam, who teaches Janelle Sunday School here. But a handicapped child, in particular a handicapped child, can be extremely difficult at times. You know, an adult body with a child's mind blended together with all the frustrations can lead to some volatility and challenges that are taxing. You know, when she was born, I asked the Lord to heal her and make her well and give her a whole mind. And you know, he said no. But nah, I couldn't begin to tell you the ministry blessings and opportunities that God has brought to pass and brought to bear in our lives as a result of having a handicapped child. You see, it's for Christ's sake. If he says no, there are people to reach with the gospel of Jesus Christ, even through that infirmity.